Welcome to Boundless podcast. Today I'm joined by Terry Seymour, one of our founding coaches at Boundless You. Terry works with senior leaders and executives, helping them cut through the noise, identify the saboteurs quietly running the show in their decision making, and access the kind of clarity that decisions carrying real weight actually require. Terry, welcome.
Thanks, Ranjeet. And thank you also for that 4 minute meditation. I took advantage of that before this podcast.
That's fantastic. Great. Good to have you on show, Terry.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. I'm very grateful.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I remember I reaching out to you for being a founding coach, and I'm thankful that you accepted my invitation. And today we are having these discussions for benefit of our viewers.
Yes, excellent.
I would start with asking you this first question that you did not come to this from an academic theory standpoint. You came to it from a sitting in the room with leaders who couldn't get clear signals. What was specific decision or a specific leader that made you realize the problem wasn't in the decision itself?
Yes, thank you for that. First of all, just a short introduction on top of yours. So, what I do is I work with experienced C-suite and VP leaders on decisions that should be clear but aren't. The facts are known, the options aren't exotic, and that decision is still not resolving. And usually that's not a thinking problem, it's a noise. It's noise that's accumulated in the environment around the decision. And once you clear that, the decision gets obvious again. So I want to address your question again. Yes, no, I didn't come from an academic point of view, although that's in my history. My father being a PhD, but that wasn't my path. So it wasn't really one decision. It was a pattern I kept seeing across decades of this work. So I'd sit with a leader who was capable, experienced, genuinely good at their job, and they'd be stuck on a decision that on paper wasn't that complicated. You know, they had good options, they had good information, great teams, and they tell me they felt like something was wrong with them, that they've lost their edge, that they shouldn't be able to see this clearly and couldn't. They should be able to see clearly and couldn't. So what I kept noticing is that the decision itself wasn't the problem. The environment around it had gotten so thick, with prior commitments, other people's expectations, old versions of themselves they were trying to be consistent with, that they couldn't see the decision on its own terms anymore. They were misdiagnosing an environmental problem as a personal one. And that's the misdiagnosis the whole book is built around.
All right, that's great. That's great that it is your lived experiences which you have captured, and absolutely that is fantastic that the clarity which you're bringing in, that it is a noise, it is not the decision itself, it is a noise which they have to cut through to get to that clarity. So that is fantastic way of looking at things.
Right. Thank you.
So moving on, you have recently published your books, and just would like to understand that the book's central claim is that clarity is recovered, not manufactured. That's a statement.
Right.
Most leadership advice assumes the opposite, that you build clarity through more process, more data, more frameworks. Why is that assumption wrong, Terry?
Well, because add more information, it's kind of like corporate duct tape, right? You don't
Yeah.
you don't fix you don't fix a foggy windshield by bolting extra headlights. You clean the glass. So the truth of a decision is almost always already sitting right there, patiently, like a cat that knows exactly where the sunny spot is, right in the room. So the real work isn't manufacturing insight, like it's a quarterly deliverable. It's getting the junk out of the way so people can see what was already true.
Okay. So you use the ham radio metaphor, the idea of signal that's always present versus a noise obscuring it. Where did this image come from, and why did it end up carrying the whole framework? It's very interesting, by the way, how you use ham radio metaphor.
Yeah, so that's kind of a personal one, right? So my father served in the Coast Guard in the South Pacific during World War II. You know,
Uh-huh.
he was running radio communications, and then after the war, he stayed a ham radio operator his whole life. So one of my earliest memories is being brought into his radio room and hearing nothing but static, right?
Hmm.
So he turned one dial, then another, small, precise adjustments, and gradually a voice would emerge out of that static. It was very clear, very present, like it had been there the whole time. And so, because it had been, he wasn't creating that voice, he was removing what stood between him and it. And decades later, sitting with senior leaders who couldn't resolve decisions no matter how much analysis they threw at them, I recognized the same basic structure. The signal was present. The work was never to manufacture it. The work was to find, what was obscuring it and turn the dial.
All right. So it is quite interesting to have this realization, and for me also, this is kind of a understanding that the signal is always there. We just have to tune into that signal so that we are in sync with the situation. That is what possibly you are trying to mean.
Yes, absolutely.
Great, great. Now, if you can walk me through what you mean by noise, because you're talking about noise in this case. So, walk me through what you mean by noise, because I don't think that most executive would describe their environment that way. What does noise actually look like inside a real decision?
Right. So if you think about it, noise is any kind of accumulated environmental influence that competes with the signal for a
Hmm.
leader's attention without actually being part of the decision. So I break it into four layers. Structural, that's the formal processes and constraints around the decision. Stakeholder, that's the pressures and expectations of the people watching. There's historical, which is the weight of prior commitments and past versions of yourself. And then internal, fear, identity investment, the stories you're telling yourself about what this decision means about you. And here's the part that surprises people. None of those things are illegitimate on their own. A real financial constraint is real. A stakeholder's concern, that's genuine. So the problem isn't that these things exist, it's that they accumulate past their actual relevance and start reshaping how the decision itself is seen. That's noise, not bad information, legitimate information that's colonized more of the decision space than it actually deserves.
Got it. This is quite deep thinking, possibly one has to do to understand and then segregate from the information with the noise, which is required to be effectively taking decisions.
Right. Yeah. So none of it's lying to you. It's just a whole choir singing along when you're trying to hear one voice ask a simple question. That's essentially it.
So you draw a hard distinction between feeling certain and feeling clear. Those sound like they should be the same thing. Why aren't they? And how does a leader tell which one they are actually operating from? How do they identify?
Yeah, that's a very valid question, and the distinction. Once we talk about it, I think will you know clear the clouds. So one of the guests on my podcast was a CEO, and they gave me what I considered, maybe one of the cleanest versions of this I've ever heard. I asked him about a consequential decision and whether in that moment he felt clear or certain. So he sat with it a minute and then he realized he felt certain, not necessarily clear. And those two states feel almost identical from the inside. And that's exactly what makes the distinction dangerous. So here's the actual difference, not just vocabulary. Um, Certainty is how confident you feel about your read on a situation. It doesn't check whether the environmental noise around that situation has actually been cleared. It just reports your confidence level, whether or not the fog is gone. Clarity is the state after the noise has genuinely been reduced. So you can feel completely certain inside a badly distorted environment. Certainty doesn't know the distortion is there. That's why it's not a matter of degree. You know, a leader can be highly certain and not remotely clear at the same time about the exact same situation. So maybe another way to put it is certainty is a feeling, clarity is a feeling that survived contact with reality, right? So they they feel identical from the inside, and that's what makes that so dangerous, as I said before. But certainty doesn't care whether the noise around the decision has actually been cleared or whether you just stop noticing it's there. So ask anyone who's driven the wrong way down a one-way street with total conviction and the high beams on, right? So uh, that's kind of the distinction.
Understood. I don't think that many executive would look at this with such clarity. I would say on certainty. While they sound very similar, but they have very distinct characteristics, as you are
Very,
explaining.
yes, sir.
All right. So you have named something called the alignment tax, the ongoing cost organization pay for decisions that reached execution without enough clarity. Can you make that concrete for our viewers? What does that tax actually look like inside a company?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you maybe boil it down. So it's alignment tax. It's the invisible fee your company pays for shipping a half-baked decision, right?
Hmm.
There's clarification cost. Everyone slacking weight. You know, what did we actually decide? There's reconciliation cost. Three teams quietly executing three different versions of the same memo, like it's a game of telephone, you know,
Hmm.
with a budget attached. And then correction costs, you know, that's the expensive one, where in Q3 you discover half the building's been building the wrong thing very diligently for months. Nobody puts alignment tax on a P&L line, but everybody pays for it anyway. So it has those kind of three, you know, components. And the things the thing leaders get wrong is where they file that cost. They call it an execution problem, an alignment problem, a communication problem, and they invest in more meetings, more process, more check-ins to manage. But it's not execution failure, it's the downstream bill for a decision that left the room without enough clarity in it to begin with. You don't fix the alignment tax at the point where you're paying for it, right? You fix it at the source.
Half big decisions. So, and reconciliation costs. What we are saying that there would be different teams, those who would be working in silos, and decisions are not coming because they are working in silos, possibly, and the decisions are not fully kind of baked in that sense, and that is why possibly you're using this term called half baked decisions, and because of that companies end up paying alignment tax while it is not appearing on the P&L.
Correct. But when you think about it from the execution of a decision as it filters through the organization, you know, the different layers of an organization, you know, you might get entirely different outcomes, or at least, and once you've made that investment, obviously, the one that's the the most costly is the correction cost. That's the most expensive one.
Got it. That's quite again, I mean, quite deep to understand the things. All right, so there is a moment in the book where 90 minutes of stripping away noise accomplished what 4 months of committee process couldn't. What was actually happening in that room during those 90 minutes, Terry?
So that's from a CEO in professional service, who I know, who's described exactly that. 4 months in committee, all of it legitimate work, none of it moving the decision.
Hmm.
Then 90 minutes doing nothing but removing everything that wasn't the actual decision. And then it became obvious, not easy, but obvious. What was happening is what I call a signal session. You map the environment, all four noise layers that we talked about, and you find out what's actually been decided versus what's only been assumed. So that last part is huge. A lot of what people are carrying isn't a real commitment. It's an unspoken expectation that they never corrected. And it's sitting on them with the full emotional weight of something they agreed to. And once you separate what's real from what's assumed, and bracket the legitimate but irrelevant noise, the decision that's left is usually much smaller and much clearer than the one they walked in with. The facts never changed in that room, the conditions foreseeing them did. So, like, 4 months of committee work produced excellent meeting minutes and zero decisions, right? 90 minutes of actually removing the noise produced a decision so obvious the guy looked mildly annoyed it hadn't shown up sooner, like he'd been looking for his glasses while wearing them, basically. Nothing
That's
new
a
got covered in the room. We just stopped, handing him everybody else's anxiety dressed up as facts.
completely agree. And I have also experienced this in my workplace, in which we would go in meeting uh, with certain agenda, but we will just speak. We'll have minutes of meeting, and then next meeting would again we start with the same discussion without even looking at what was discussed in the last meeting. And this process will continue, and we would never reach a decision unless until some thing is breaking, and then we just go haphazard manner and take some decision in that situation. So what you are trying to say that if we can cut those noises, then our ability to reach the decision becomes much easier. It is not so complex.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And what I try to do in the book is create these distinctions because the distinctions help you see it, right? Help you become aware of it. Usually things that flow through by life, on the conveyor belt, you don't stop to examine them. So the distinctions help you do that. And then, it's like the reticulating activation system, right? As long as when you see it there, then it's easier for you to discover it the next time.
Got it. Understood. So a lot of leaders you work with, Terry, like VP, C-suite, director level, have built their careers on exactly the things your framework asked them to question: gather more input, run more analysis, demonstrate more thoroughness. What do you say to those leaders who hear this and thinks you are asking them to do less at the rigor, not more?
I tell them I'm not asking for less rigor. I'm asking them to point the rigor at the right target, right?
Okay.
So the behavioral economics tradition, Kahneman and Tversky's work, which I put in the book, is right that judgment under pressure gets systematically distorted.
Hmm.
Where I differ is on the remedy. So their prescription is additive, more checklists, more structured process, more correction layered onto an already noisy environment. That's real evidence based work and it has value. But it doesn't ask why the bias got activated in the first place. And usually It's because the environment already had too much noise in it. So the higher leverage move isn't adding another analytical layer, it's reducing what's distorting the read before you analyze anything. That's not less rigorous. It's rigor applied one step earlier to the conditions of perception instead of just the content of the decision. I'm not asking anybody to skip the homework. I'm asking them to stop doing homework on the wrong subject. So if the test is on subtraction and you keep restudying multiplication, more studying isn't the fix, right? It's just very disciplined confusion. Most leaders didn't get soft, they got surrounded, right?
Hmm.
Pointing all that rigor at the noise instead of at the actual decision is the whole trick.
You use this term, very disciplined confusion. Is that what you used?
Yeah, e- essentially, it's like it's pointing at the wrong target. I think that's the message. So you're not, it's not any less rigor or homework. It's just very simply pointing at the right problem, right?
But that's the right way of framing it. The confusion, but it's very disciplined. Perfect. And you also write about the consequence decoupling, holding the full weight of what a decision costs you while still evaluating it on its own terms. That's not a technique most people can just adopt. What did learning that actually cost you?
Well, there's a story in the book about a founder who turned down a $250,000 contract renewal, right? So he didn't pretend the money didn't matter. He held its full weight genuinely and still made the decision on a separate basis where the business actually needed to go.
Mhm.
That's consequence decoupling. It's not detachment, it's not false optimism. Uh, the discipline of putting a real future consequence in its proper place so it stops distorting the present decision, right? So that's really the essence of that, and that's what I came to know over a period of time.
Very interesting. And I am learning new terms, Terry, and thank you very much for bringing them. Consequence decoupling, I've never heard of this kind.
I didn't either.
Possible.
I didn't either, but there was a distinction that had to be made, and so it's kind of like a made up thing. I don't know if anybody uses it, but that's how I describe it in the best terms I can.
No, but very interesting. I'm possibly gonna look for. Since you are in USA, I wish I had your book copy. I would have read it completely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So your work is explicitly governed by what you do. Every thought measured by love and service before any consideration of what performs or converts. That's an unusual thing to put at the center of a leadership methodology.
Right.
Built on the C suite, why put it here out loud rather than letting it stay implicit?
Yes. Very valid question. So just to complete the thought, every thought measured by love, every word measured by truth, and every action measured by service. So that's the pattern I want to live in my life. I don't always measure up to that, but that's really the life purpose. So why did I put it out there out loud rather than letting it stay implicit? Because if it stays implicit, it basically stops functioning as a filter and starts functioning as decoration, right?
Mhm.
So I wanted a standard that runs before the marketing filter, before the conversion filter, something you can actually stop, a tactic that would otherwise perform well. So a claim that persuades, but it's isn't fully true, fails that standard regardless of how well it lands. An offer built to extract rather than serve fails fails it regardless of revenue. So I put it out loud because um, I don't trust myself or this work to hold that line silently under commercial pressure. Naming it, love, truth, and service in that order before anything else, it makes it something I can be held accountable to, including by the people closest to me who see the gap between what I teach and what I practice more clearly than anyone. So that's the filter that's allowed to veto a good idea if it's built to extract rather than actually help someone. And honestly, it's the only thing standing between this work and me becoming one more guy with a framework and accountability.
Perfect. That's very great that you are basically bringing your teachings into what you are practicing in real life. That's great. So you have built ClearSignal specifically to resist becoming another framework that nudges leaders toward a predetermined answer. That's a strange thing to design against. Most consultants want to be persuasive. What were you protecting by building it that way?
Yeah. Uh, the leader's actual authority over their own decision. Most frameworks, even the well-intentioned ones, they converge, right? They're built to guide you toward a particular kind of outcome.
Hmm.
Clear signal removes the noise. It doesn't lean the leader toward yes or toward bold or toward whatever the practitioner privately thinks is the right call.
Hmm.
If I influence the outcome, I've just added a new layer of noise, my noise, on top of everything else that was already distorting their view. So that's why the process is explicitly designed to resist converting clarity into commitment. The signal is theirs. My job is to get the environment out of the way so they can see it, not to tell them what they'll find. What I'm protecting is really the difference between genuine clarity and a well-produced version of my own opinion.
Now it's kind of making sense to me as well because you started with that metaphor of ham radio, in which the signal is there, you're tuning into the signal. So that is very well now reflecting in what you're saying here, that you are not trying to bring a new framework, which is like a new signal. Signal is already there. All you are trying to basically help to align and tune into that particular signal. That's what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, most frameworks are quietly trying to get you to agree with the person who built the framework,
Hmm.
right? So mine's
Yeah.
mine's built to resist that on purpose. The day I start, nudging people toward my preferred answer, I become exactly the kind of noise I'm supposed to be clearing out. Nobody hires a window washer who smudges the glass a little on the way out the door. So uh, that's what I hold true to.
Great. So, is there a decision in your own leadership or business life, maybe even this book or this business, where you had to apply clear signal to yourself and didn't love what you found?
Yeah, so that shape tends to land for me. Naming the noise, I'm actually, fear of being seen as too small, pressure to look further along than I actually am. An old professional identity I'm protecting. Uh, so I want to be honest about that. I tripped. There was a lot of introspection involved. I've had a very long career in technology, 40 years. And so the introspection allowed me to come to this place where I could start making those distinctions and really shifting my focus toward, more away from the internal benefit or value I get out of something toward what is the external value that I can create? What is the value that I can create for someone else? So that's what helped me along was that introspection, really looking deep and asking those questions. And that's sort of how things evolved into my practice.
Awesome. Awesome. So, if a leader takes nothing else from this conversation, what's the one question you want them asking the next time a decision that should be clear isn't?
Yeah, I think what I want them to ask is, whose noise is this?
Hmm.
You know, before you schedule another meeting or commission another round of analysis, stop and ask what's actually in the room that isn't the decision itself. Is it a prior commitment, someone else's expectation, an old story about who you have to be here? I mean, name it. And it starts when you name it, it starts to lose its grip, not because you resolved it, but because you can finally see it as separate from the decision instead of it being fused to the decision. So that single question is a whole method compressed. Everything else in the book is, what do you do once you've asked that question? Whose noise is that? Whose noise is this?
That's the question you want to leave the leaders with. Understood. And that's a very pragmatic question to ask, basically. This will allow them to introspect, think deeper.
Yes. Well, that distinction makes all the difference in the world, because as soon as you ask it, now you actually have the distinction between a signal and noise, and so you can start separating that out in a way that's actually going to benefit you. It's all about coming back to, look, there's nothing out there that hasn't been discovered or said before. This is more of a lived realization that people come to, that can be articulated and recognized, and bring it from an unconscious level to a conscious one, the awareness, and then you can build it like any muscle and develop it over time. So that was my intention, is to get it front and center, uh, have give a forum for people to become aware of these things, to use it in a way that's is going to further their purposes.
Fantastic. So, you have talked a lot of senior leaders through your own podcast about what leadership actually feels like once competence is assumed and titles stop resolving uncertainty. What's the thing almost none of them say out loud until you ask them the right way?
Yeah, good question. They're still operating from fear, even at the very top. They just don't call it that anymore, right? One
Hmm.
one guest described it as a vibration of fear underneath a decision she'd already convinced herself was strategic. Another one told me that letting go of the need to know everything was the thing that actually freed him after building an entire identity around being the guy who always knew. So nobody says it in a standard interview format, because the standard questions are about frameworks and achievements. Uh, the podcast exists because I don't ask those questions. I ask what it actually felt like in the room. And what comes back almost every time is some version of, I was managing an old pattern I built my career on, and it had quietly become the thing distorting my judgment. I mean, that they're all still scared. They just gotten very good at wearing a blazer over it, right? It, after building an entire identity on being the guy with the answer. So it turns out, I don't know yet is a complete sentence, even in the C suite. Nobody teaches you that in a leadership offsite.
Very interesting. So, leaders also have this fear factor at the top.
Yes.
Amazing. Amazing to know. Because a lot depends on their decision. That is why possibly they are fearful. Possibly. All right. So, what's true about this work that you haven't figured out how to say cleanly yet?
That the recovery, the recovery of clarity and the recovery of something more spiritual are the same motion. And I'm still finding language for that without it sounding like I'm asking a CEO to have a conversion experience in a business book, right? The framework language, signal, noise, alignment tax is precise and useful, and it's the front door. But underneath it, what I actually believe is that the clear answer was placed there before the noise ever arrived, and the work of removing distortion is really closer to a spiritual discipline than a business one.
Fabulous, fabulous. I think we need to have some amount of spirituality, definitely, so that the decisions which we take are more seem aligned. Mind and soul must get aligned with whatever decisions we are taking. Uh, Thank you very much, Terry, for answering my questions and talking about your book, which you have written. I wish you all the best for the success of your book. And as founding coach of Boundless You, I look forward to working with you closely, specifically in for with the Indian clients. So let's build it together.
I'm looking forward to that. And just for your audience, just to be clear, the name of the book is Clear Signal: Why Leadership Decisions That Should Be the Clearest Are the Hardest to See. And you can get it on Amazon, either in paperback or ebook format.
Fabulous, great, great to have you. And again, once again, all the best to you and or your
Thank
book.
you. Thank you so much, Ranjeet.
Thank
Very
you very
grateful.
much. Thank you.